Hello and welcome to Number by Color. My name is Todd, and I just finished playing what seems to me to be one of the most divisive games in recent memory. That, of course, is The Last of Us Part 2. I debated back and forth with myself on whether or not I should do a normal review style video or a discussion style video because there's so much here to talk about. But I ultimately chose to do my normal style review because I feel like there's a lot that I will miss if I don't have a script keeping me on track. It should also be noted that this video is going to have a lot of story spoilers. Now, I usually try to avoid spoilers as much as possible, but since this series is practically made or broken by the story, I can't really talk about the game in any meaningful way without going over the story, its twists, and the implications that it presents. Because of that, this review may be disproportionately story heavy. And I also only usually record video footage of the game for the first few hours of the game, so at some point, what I'm talking about in the review may not really reflect what you're seeing on the screen. And partly this is due to me not wanting to spoil it for anybody who might be hovering over my thumbnail and who hasn't played the game yet. I don't want to give away anything to those people. I don't want to spoil anything for them. But also because, I just normally don't record video past that long anyway. And I didn't realize when I was playing through the game that I would have so much to talk about story-wise. But here we are, and hopefully you enjoy what I have to say. But let's get into it. The Last of Us Part 2 is a PlayStation 4 exclusive that was developed by Naughty Dog and published by Sony in June of 2020, roughly 7 years after the first game released on the PlayStation 3. Back then, there was no indication that a sequel would be made or was even wanted by fans, but game director and co-writer Neil Druckmann decided there were still more stories to be told in this post-apocalyptic world. As I mentioned earlier, The Last of Us Part 2 has a narrative that is really divisive. I'm not really the type of person to hyper-analyze every aspect of a story, but I can still give my general thoughts as to whether or not I think it works. And as far as I'm concerned, the story in The Last of Us Part 2 works well. That's not to say that there aren't problems with its overall construction and execution, but for me, I really liked what Naughty Dog did here. They killed Joel. The inciting incident of this game is that Joel is murdered, and we later discover that Abby, the woman who murdered him, was the daughter of the Firefly doctor that Joel murdered to save Ellie in the first game. Usually in stories like this, it is difficult to get the player to sympathize with the antagonist, but this game does it. Joel was not a good person in the first game. Whether or not he regrets his decision, which he doesn't, he sacrificed a cure for a global disease for the life of his surrogate daughter. And I, like most other people, felt a strong connection to Joel and Ellie in the first game. But I can't deny that, ethically speaking, Joel's actions are questionable. And even though Abby spent 4 years training and searching for Joel with the intent of getting revenge, I can't fault her for wanting to avenge her father's death. Which is why I also can't fault Ellie for wanting to avenge Joel's death. So you see, this game begins with a cycle of revenge. The moral dilemmas that are presented are ones that make you really think about what is happening. I mentioned that Abby spent 4 years searching for Joel. When she finally is able to kill him, she also has the opportunity to kill Ellie and Tommy, but she lets them live. Her goal was only Joel. She didn't want to kill needlessly. She is not an inherently violent person. Unless, of course, she comes face to face with a Seraphite, but we'll get to them later. And to further prove this point, Abby actually has a second opportunity to kill Ellie, Tommy, and Dina when she finds them in the theater, but she chooses not to, instead warning them to never come near her again. Abby does kill Jesse, but this is almost out of necessity. This is all in stark contrast to Tommy and Ellie. From their perspectives, they don't care who they have to kill, as long as it gets them closer to Abby. They are sloppy, and they end up killing all of Abby's friends. Ellie in particular seems to act before thinking in almost every situation. What's sad is that none of Abby's friends were truly bad people. They just happened to be with her when she killed Joel, so they become guilty by association. I've been saying a lot about the motivations of the two protagonists, and while I do think the general story here is good and interesting, it's not without its flaws. First of all, the game is essentially split in half, making you play as Ellie for the first half and Abby for the second half. This is done for shock value, and even though it worked for me, it's a risky choice. I don't know if there's really another way Naughty Dog could have done this, because I think switching between Ellie and Abby throughout the game would make people want to rush Abby's sections just to get back to Ellie. But it does disjoint the story, especially because it takes so long from the start of Abby's section before we even see Ellie again and continue the main narrative thread. Instead, we're taken down a completely different story path in the form of Yara and Lev, a brother and sister pair of runaway Seraphites trying to avoid capture. The reason for this is because Abby's motivations are completely different from Ellie's. Ellie is fully focused on revenge. Abby's already gotten her revenge, so she's not thinking about Ellie at all for most of her story sections. This kind of tonal shift helps to somewhat lighten the bleakness of the game, but it might be jarring for those who aren't expecting it. Secondly, Abby's story seems like almost an entirely different game from a story perspective. Because we are now focused on Yara and Lev and the Seraphites, we have a whole new set of characters, factions, and cults to learn about. I ultimately liked everything that the two siblings added to the story, but I can't help but wonder if the game should have been focused on the Seraphites and the Wolves and left Joel and Ellie alone. Learning about the cult of the Scars was fascinating, but their island is destroyed almost as fast as it was introduced. At a certain point, Lev comments to Abby that she needs to read the writings of the Seraphite founder because the way the Seraphites are acting is way out of line with the founder's original views. I would have loved to be more immersed in the origins of this group and really understand why they live the way they do. Instead, they're just painted as religious zealots who dislike technology, and Yara and Lev are the only two we really learn anything about. That being said, the dynamic between Yara, Lev, and Abby is really well done, in my opinion, and I'm glad it was included in the game. Speaking of Yara and Lev, there were many other side characters in this game, most of which I didn't really care for. But I think that's partly due to how well realized they were. On Ellie's side, we have Dina and Jesse. I liked Jesse a lot. He was smart and logical, and he had good chemistry with Ellie. Dina, on the other hand, never really felt like a good companion. She doesn't seem to have much chemistry at all with Ellie, and after the first day in Seattle, her role becomes simply to stay in the theater because she's sick from her pregnancy. I never really felt a connection between her and Ellie, and I never felt like I knew her as a person, and I wish I did. On Abby's side, her friends don't fare much better, though in this case it's not because I felt like I didn't know them as people, it's because I just didn't like the people they were. Which is an important difference. Apart from the Seraphites, Manny is really the only other person in Abby's group I cared about. He's got a friendly personality and wants everybody to be happy and get along. Owen is kind of abrasive, but he did eventually grow on me. And I never liked Mel. She's helpful when Yara is hurt, but I found her to be otherwise generally unpleasant. I've been talking a lot about Ellie and Abby as being protagonists, but I don't even fully see them that way. They're both not always good people. Ellie and Abby both push away the people close to them because they're too focused on revenge. Abby basically has no close personal relationships. Ellie leaves her girlfriend and child in order to travel 1,000 miles alone to find Abby. They're both broken and flawed and unable to get out of their own way, and that's what makes them both so compelling. The way the narrative is woven in this game is more complex than simply being split in half, and I only played through the game one time, but even so, there's a lot here that I enjoyed, and I'll likely need to play through again to get a better understanding of the characters with the story's full context in my mind. Finally, regarding the story, one of the most important plot devices used in this game are flashbacks. Oddly enough, the flashback sequences are sometimes what provide the most context to everything happening in the game, and they're also the way we're able to see more of Joel and Ellie's relationship develop. There are only a few flashbacks for both Abby and Ellie, which is unfortunate, as I would have liked to have had a little more time to explore Joel and Ellie's falling out, but they still provide a welcome break from the narrative. Let's get into talking about something a little less divisive. The gameplay in The Last of Us Part 2 is a marked improvement over the first game in every way. I have said that it's 100% better, and I stand by that. Almost every aspect from the first game is here, and they're all improved and expanded upon. Gunplay feels better and more tactile, stealth is often mandatory and exciting, and the enemy AI is vastly improved. I often found myself strategizing on which weapons to use to take out which enemies because I almost never had full ammo, and I always had to choose my course of action wisely. In sections with large enemy encounters, the mix between action and stealth was always fun and felt satisfying. That being said, human enemies rarely gave me any trouble on moderate difficulty, but I still felt like there was a good challenge, especially when it comes to fighting some of the stronger infected. I'll also point out that pretty much all the weapons and craftable items are the same as the first game, with some notable additions, like the hunting pistol and crossbow, but even if many of the weapons are the same, they still felt really good to use, and upgrading them was always immediately rewarding. Speaking of weapon upgrades, T-Lu Part 2 brings back both weapon and player upgrades, and this time around, they both feel much more meaningful. Weapon upgrades are admittedly very similar to the first game, with most upgrades consisting of either expanding ammo capacity, better scopes, or added stability, but even so, each upgrade felt like an immediate improvement. Player upgrades, on the other hand, have a complete overhaul. Actually, it's not quite as drastic as it seems, but in some ways it is. In the first game, Joel would find supplements lying around the world, and he would use them to improve things by increasing health, reducing crafting speeds, and enhancing listening mode. Occasionally, he would also find training manuals that would improve the strength of healing kits, increase the potency of crafted explosives, and improve his shiv abilities. In Part 2, these two things are combined, and both Abby and Ellie can find up to 5 training manuals each that offer all sorts of player upgrades. I think this system is overall better because it gives the player more options as to how they want to develop their characters. Supplements are also more common, which means it's never going to be too long before you can learn another upgrade. In the first game, it took so long to get enough supplements for the skill you wanted that I almost felt discouraged from not just getting whatever I could afford, even if it didn't seem that useful. That problem doesn't exist in Part 2. Even general exploration is improved. Environments have incredible levels of detail, and you can clearly tell a lot of attention was taken to create the landscapes and cityscapes. Some areas are so big that they require a horse or a boat to travel through them. I found these sections to be really fun to explore and navigate. On the first day especially, Ellie and Dina explore Seattle, and there are 8 or so locations to visit, most of which are optional. I do think presenting the player with such a large open space right at the start of the journey is a little odd as far as pacing is concerned, but I still found myself wanting to see everything. And I'm really glad I did, because there are some really fun Easter eggs hidden around here, like Nathan Drake's ring from the Uncharted series. Open areas aren't the only addition to exploration either. Ellie and Abby can now go prone as a means of further avoiding detection around enemies or crawling through tight spaces. They can also jump, which isn't really that interesting of a mechanic, because it doesn't really do anything for you outside of bridging gaps, but it's still nice to have. And if you liked collecting comics and artifacts in the first game, you'll most likely enjoy doing that here as well. However, this time around, instead of collecting comics, Ellie collects trading cards, which, in my opinion, are much cooler than the comics from the first game. Each card is different, and they all have unique and interesting write-ups about the character. I found myself getting excited each time I picked up a new card, because the designs were often really interesting, and it made me reminiscent of when I collected cards, and it makes me want to go get the full collection. Abby also has her own collection in the form of United States state coins, similar to the ones that were popular in the early 2000s. These aren't quite as interesting as the trading cards, but I liked collecting these as well, and I was always interested to see the designs on them. I also found it to be a touching connection she has to her father. Before moving on, I want to give a shout out to a few notable set piece moments, including the touching scene in the space shuttle pod, the giant rat king in the hospital at Ground Zero, traversing across building rooftops hundreds of feet in the air with Abby and Lev, and riding a horse through a burning village while enemies actively tried to shoot you and climb onto your horse. These were all incredible in their own way, and they really help take the game to new levels of excitement. Visually, The Last of Us Part 2 is one of the best looking games I have ever played. From the realistic character models and animation, to the dense environments, to the detail of every texture, to the realism of the rain and snowstorms, it is clear that a lot of love went into making this game look as good as possible. I really don't have anything bad to say here. There are several character models for every single character, and there's even a decent amount of variation in the infected designs. Naughty Dog usually does a superb job in the art department, and they really deliver with this game. The music and sound design are similarly excellent. Even in the first game, music was sparse, but anytime it came in, it felt appropriate and meaningful. This game brings the sound design to a whole new level. There's even a functioning guitar that the player can play by using the DualShock Force touchpad. It's really amazing to see so much detail given to something many people won't even try to experiment with. Actually, one of the more touching scenes for me happens early in the game, when Ellie finds a guitar in a long-abandoned music shop and performs her own version of a-ha's classic song Take On Me. This was so unexpected, but so endearing. The guitar is one of the few things that Ellie has inherited from Joel, and it was kind of surreal to hear her perform the song for Dina. The rest of the sound design, from the sounds of nature, to environmental sounds, to the noises the infected make, to the wiping, screwing, and clicking of upgrading your guns, are all expertly crafted. There were a few occasions where I had to play the game with headphones, and I found it to be so much more immersive when I didn't have my normal house sounds to distract me. In fact, some sections were much creepier with headphones on, so that's definitely the way to play if you're into that kind of thing. We all know I have to at least mention trophies, and I'm really happy to say that the list for this game is so much better than the first game. Mainly because there are no trophies for playing online multiplayer. Every trophy here is doable, and most of them are related to crafting, learning skills, and finding collectibles. There isn't even a trophy for playing on the highest difficulty, so this list is really accessible for every player if they're willing to spend a little bit of time hunting everything down. I came into this game with high expectations from Naughty Dog, and I was not let down at all. I think that mostly has to do with my desire to let them tell me a story they thought was necessary. I expected a lot from the game, but I didn't have any preconceived expectations of what the story should be. And I think that really helped me get over some of the odd narrative decisions. Sure, I would have liked to have had another game with Joel and Ellie, but I also didn't necessarily want a sequel in the first place. And I certainly didn't want something where the main story conflict was with Ellie finding out Joel lied to her. That seems too easy, and The Last of Us is not a franchise that settles for easy. This world has people who are not just black and white, good or bad, and The Last of Us Part 2 shows us that there is even more than meets the eye with almost everybody that we meet. Killing off a beloved character early in the game and then forcing us to play as the killer is definitely a bold and risky choice. But in my opinion, it really works. I know it's not to everybody's liking, but I think Naughty Dog did a really good job here. Making a sequel to one of the most revered games of the last decade was never going to be easy, and it was always bound to disappoint some people. Even though I liked it, I can understand why others might not have. And I actually don't really even want another sequel. At least not with these characters. I don't think I really want to see Ellie endure more hardship. So what did you guys think? Did you like the game? It's so controversial that I almost wasn't sure if I should even do a review video or not. And this is probably one of my lengthiest, which is kind of crazy, but thank you for sticking around this far if you have. I'll be back soon with another video, but thank you for watching this, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and until next time, I'll see you around.